This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. What was originally projected to be an explosive election year ends tomorrow with barely a fizzle. Still, the outcome of key runoffs will be decisive for the state's politics. There will be more fizzle than fizz from Faubourg Brewery, the descendant of the former Dixie Beer brand, which is reducing its operations. We'll discuss these stories as well as an update on water testing procedure. And since a key ingredient in local Thanksgiving dressings is oysters, we'll examine the condition of the industry. Plus, with the upcoming week being the 60th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, we'll look at local connections to the ongoing saga. At our table are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Rich Collins, Associate News Editor, Biz New Orleans, Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Greg LaRose, editor, Louisiana Illuminator. And we will stay with Greg to talk about the general election, which is tomorrow, Saturday. So there are two key state races that are still up for grabs right now. So what are those looking like?
Well, three, actually. If you start with the Attorney General, in which you have Liz Muriel going up against latecomer Democrat Lindsey Cheek. There's also the Secretary of State with First Assistant Nancy Landry, the Republican, running against Gwen Greenup Collins. And in the Treasurer's race, former Congressman and Republican Trump administration member John Fleming going against the Democrat Dustin Granger. And it's that race that I think is going to be most compelling because Granger polled better than any other Democrat, even governor's candidate Sean Wilson in the October primary. He's got, I guess, the requisite experience for the job. That's going to be the most compelling. The most consequential, I think, is the Attorney General's race because you have a really good shot that you'll have someone who's in lockstep with the governor on a lot of conservative policies. I would expect there to be a continuance of numerous challenges to Biden administration policy once both take office.
Yeah. So Liz Muriel, we have the Attorney General candidates up there right now, is the Republican, Lindsey Cheek, the Democrat. You know, the Republicans now have really just about all statewide offices. We're taking a look at these contests here. And then also they're going to be supermajority in the legislature. So is the assumption that it looks like we may have a Republican in that office, Attorney General?
I think it's a high likelihood here. Lindsey Cheek was such a late entry in the woes of the state Democratic Party and its inability to really gel around solid candidates has been documented. But Muriel's campaigned strongly, and I think she's critical to the down ticket races Saturday because without Jeff Landry on the ballot, there isn't that motivation, you know, in the strong campaign there. Although I will say I think in the runoff, Muriel's been a pretty steady presence on airwaves, and I think she beat a pretty good drum for the Republican ticket.
And she said a lot of powerful endorsements in the commercials. She said a good television campaign.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, Donald Trump came out in favor of all three Republicans in the runoff. I think you can squarely point to, as Marcia points out, the Republican-dominated state government, really a lot of it rides on the coattails of a very popular Republican, highly likely Republican nominee in Trump next year for the presidential race.
You know, that's the path we're seeing in a lot of Louisiana elections now, where you have a Democrat providing or the other Democrats, they usually have a ticket into a runoff, but then they lose the runoff because they're overwhelmed by Republicans.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the case unless there's a surprise in store with Dustin Granger. He's definitely separated himself as the progressive candidate. Those are the most motivated voters in the party. The key will be, can he get enough middle-of-the-road folks who aren't going to vote regardless of whoever the Republican candidate is to come out and support him? And turnout, it's going to be embarrassingly low. There's no other way to sugarcoat it.
Yeah, really, I mean, it was embarrassingly low in the primary, so we're
Well,
not
and this
anticipating.
Saturday before a holiday just seems like
Yeah.
True.
stupid timing.
In LSU homecoming, there's a lot going on. Weather should be nice, which you think would encourage people to vote, but they sometimes find other things to do in nice weather.
I think they're projecting 20% turnout. You know, but it's
Could
not
be
like-
generous.
Yeah.
Could be generous.
Yeah. Okay, and let's revisit really quickly again the Secretary of State, because we didn't get that up on the screen.
Yeah.
And see the candidates and a little bit more about them.
Yeah, Gwen Collins Greenup ran previously for the office. She's an accountant up in East Feliciana Parish. Neat little side story for her, really quickly. In her free time, she's a high school football official and was part of a crew earlier this year that was entirely comprised of women.
That's cool.
Nancy Landry has been Kyle Ardoin's right-hand person, if you will. She is a former state lawmaker, very active in Republican politics, and seems to be the strong candidate at this point. Again, the Republican ticket, strong by far.
So it's the possibility we have a governor and secretary of state who are both Landrys, and that's certainly an
True, a
established,
little confusing, but yeah.
an established Louisiana name.
Yes, indeed.
And the Secretary of State oversees our elections too, right?
Yeah,
Federal
there are
elections.
a few museums under that office, the state archives, but they are business registrations as well. The spotlight job is overseeing the elections.
Which of course is important because
Sure.
elections, as we have learned from the past presidential election, can be controversial.
Yeah, I really think a lot of people just slept on that race, given that Louisiana is going to be replacing its voting systems, perhaps in front of next year's presidential election. I don't know that necessarily we've settled on one system. The consensus seems to be an electronic voting system that produces a paper record, but there's still forces out there, most of them election deniers from 2020, that want a full paper ballot system. And local clerks of court are saying, yeah, that's a nightmare. We can never do that in South Louisiana.
Okay, everybody remember, there is an election tomorrow, Saturday, general election. Alrighty. Thanks a lot, Greg. Okay, Rich, over to you. We got some news this week about the Faubourg Brewery, or is it Faubourg Brewery?
Well, we had a big debate just before we went on the air.
Out in New Orleans East, they're going to make some big changes over there.
Yeah, the news is kind of a bummer, but the owner of Faubourg Brewery, I went with Faubourg, is shutting down some operations, but not all. And it was confusing when the story first hit the media this week, but I talked to two people that know, and what's happening is...
We need to qualify the owner is not Gail Benson.
She's still about a 50-50 owner.
Okay,
but the
okay.
controlling owner is a company called Made by the Water, which is an Alabama-based craft brewer that's got several other brands. So they partnered about a year ago, and the thought was these guys know beer. Gail Benson knows New Orleans, or the Bensons know New Orleans, and it's going to be this wonderful marriage where they can grow the Faubourg brand and the other brands, and they'll brew it all there at this beautiful $30 million New Orleans East facility that was created. But there's been some problems. The Made by the Water folks have been producing about 50,000 barrels of beer a year. A small percentage of that is Faubourg, actually. It's a lot of their other brands and the Faubourg beers as well. The facility can handle more beer than that, but the problems are unexpected costs because of utility bills, infrastructure problems where they've lost power a bunch of times over the last year, high water bills, high tax bills.
Sounds like everybody's problem.
Exactly, everybody's
You know,
problem.
Insurance bills, yeah.
Skyrocketing insurance. And so what's happened is this company Made by the Water has plans to grow, and they've worked hard. They've gotten together with city folks, the utility folks, economic development folks, the Bensons. They've all been meeting and trying to figure it out. And the conclusion seems to be that for them, the business decision is they can't do it in that facility. And so they're shutting down the production. The majority of that building is production for wholesale. Can it, bottle it, and send it off to the wholesalers. That's going to get shut down. A much smaller percentage of that brewery is creating draft beer for the tap room that's out there.
The Faubourg beer.
The Faubourg
yeah.
beer, and the other names. That's going to continue for the time being. The Bensons have a lease on this building that goes for several more years. So they are. The plan right now is tap room will remain. The commercial side of it's going to get sent out to contract brewers and to other Made by the Water facilities.
So most of that beer is not going to be made under that roof now.
Correct.
Just of the taproom beer.
Yeah, and
which is open to the public. You can
It
go
is,
in
yeah.
and have
But by the way, the Faubourg Brewery Company tap room is open. You can go buy beer and hang out there, and they have entertainment. All that's still happening for now.
So Made by the Water, they're going to still have their administrative offices there.
Yeah,
they're
it's
saying
confusing.
Right now.
They say, yeah. So the numbers are, between the tap room and the brewery, there was about 50 employees. This is rough. The big brewery side and the administrative side was about 40 people. That number is going to shrink down to about a quarter of that, so maybe 8 to 10 people. So we're going to go from 50 total employees to about 15-ish.
Yeah, well, that's really disappointing because there was such hopes for that facility, which years ago was the McFrugal warehouse that went ablaze. Huge fire out there. So it's that big parcel of property just right over the interstate, right over the high rise to your right. Take a look at it. Has there been a lot of traffic there?
I think part of the problem was I did talk to some other brewers as I was trying to get information for a story that we wrote this week, and what I learned is that there were some raised eyebrows a number of years ago when they said they're going to put this out there because people said the key to having a successful restaurant or tap room or brewery or any hospitality business is the foot traffic and being able to get people through. And there was worries that was going to be a problem. And they have been bringing people out there. They do events. They've done a really good job trying to make it work. But the fact that it's in a remote spot and there are some infrastructure issues around it and some crime concerns as well, it's made it hard.
I think a sobering, if I may, a sobering point of all this is we've seen so many stories of high hopes for developing things in the East, and they never really work out. If it's something that involves trying to attract families and foot traffic out there, they just don't work. All these big ambitions.
Hopefully, all of that, once the former Six Flags site was developed, will change. That should change it all.
I'm curious to hear what the other breweries, because just like from a consumer view, it looked like the urban Souths, the tap rooms, seem to be doing pretty well. And I don't know that they would advertise that things are going poorly, but...
Well, what I learned actually in this process is very interesting. Louisiana, among craft brewers, is considered a very, very difficult place to do business compared to Texas or Florida. And a lot of the policies that are in place are supportive of big beer. The two big distributors, the Bud distributor and the Miller affiliated distributor. And so one of those rules is if you are going to distribute beer as a wholesaler, you cannot sell food or liquor at your tap room, at your brewery. And so what's happened, there's a couple of people, it's happening right now, a few different of these people that we're talking about that you see at your local grocery store are going to stop distributing as well. They're going to stop distributing and focus on their hospitality side because craft beer sales are down overall, but the hospitality side is doing well enough that it makes sense for them to invest in that side.
Real quick, I like a point you made in an article this week where you're looking at the amount of money spent to develop this facility, and you compared it to Derek Carr's contract with the Saints.
Well, I was talking to one of the guys the other night. They said $30 million on this facility, and God knows how much on marketing and everything else. So maybe how much have they spent? And they're like, well, they've guaranteed Derek Carr $60 million. And it's the jury's out on which one's going to work out better.
It's inspired a few Saints fans maybe to drink more beer.
But all of that equipment stays in that building right now.
Right. It's super up in the air. They've got all this high tech. One of the guys that I talked to, it's been in there, says it's like NASA in there. This beautiful, beautiful high end equipment.
Yeah.
It's very valuable. It's also highly taxable. So the fate of all that equipment is going to be interesting to see.
Okay. All right, Rich. What do you say? The disappointment.
I know. So
all right. Thanks a lot. All right. Something that goes really good with beer is oysters. and okay, Don, how are our oysters? How are dem oysters, as the famous saying goes?
Dem oysters are good. Unlike other crops we've talked about in recent weeks, we talked about the crawfish suffering big time this year, or potentially suffering big time because of our drought conditions. The drought conditions are a positive when you're talking about oysters because less water in the water table increases the salinity, and the oysters need salinity in the water. So they're looking good for now. Oyster season typically opens right after Labor Day and runs all the way through April. I didn't realize it. They always talk about our months, but March and January, February, March, and April don't end in R.
Through November, yeah, okay.
It's September through April.
Okay.
And they open different beds at different times. The Department of Wildlife and Fisheries monitors them all to make sure they're okay, and there are limits for the oyster farmers. But it's looking good. Last year wasn't so strong. Prices, however, even though last year wasn't so strong, prices aren't coming down. They're about the same as they were last year. I spot checked some prices, and they're running at about $70 a gallon for the, and that's wholesale. In a grocery store, that same gallon might cost you $170. But that's for shucked oysters. And they're looking plentiful. You said they were looking small when you had some recently. I have not had any recently. They are worried, however, the oyster farmers are worried about the going into an El Nino season, because El Nino is supposed to bring us more rainfall. This year we are still so far below, but a much wetter climate should decrease the salinity in those oyster beds, meaning next year might not be as good. But only time will tell whether we see those storms and see that rainfall. Right now, for this oyster season, they're good. You can get a small sack with the shell still on for about $40. So prices are about the same. If you have them on your Thanksgiving menu, there's not a shortage. They're plentiful this year.
Yeah, I remember after the BP spill, there was, real concern, for that season of where we're going to get those oysters. So they're there, but you're going to have to pay for them. That's basically what I'm hearing from you right now.
Correct. I also asked if this the extensive heat this summer caused any problems for the oysters. And in a couple of small beds, they ended up without enough oxygen in the beds because it was so hot. But it was in some of the smaller, less populated oyster beds anyway. So very minimal damage from that. So, I mean, all in all, as crops are concerned, we've talked about the heat, we've talked about the drought, and for oysters, it's been an okay kind of thing for heat and
So
drought.
we should have an okay Thanksgiving in terms of oysters.
For those of you who like oyster dressing, have at it.
That's one of my favorites, absolutely. All right, Don.
I'm reading between the lines.
Yeah, if you don't grow up with it, I don't know about you, Rich. It just seems a little odd on the Thanksgiving table, but the people who love them, love them.
Yeah, I mean, we got to have them, Don. We really do. Have to have them for Thanksgiving.
It's our old baby.
And got to have them to slurp down that beer, too.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Going next Errol, over to you, because this is a pretty significant anniversary coming up next week of the JFK assassination. It's really hard to believe, 60 years.
Yeah, be coming out this week on the 22nd, will be a 60th anniversary. There's so much to talk about in limited time, so I want to start off with a story which is both happy and tragic. Okay, I want to show a picture of a singing duo, which they're called Dale and Grace. And Dale was from Louisiana, from Prairieville, Louisiana. I mean, Grace was from Prairieville, Louisiana. Dale was from Mississippi, but spent a lot of time in Louisiana. Well, anyway, a record producer out of Baton Rouge heard them sing and thought that they could, put them together and make them into a duet. And he had this song that he really liked, and he had them record it. They went to Baton Rouge, and they recorded this song called That's Why I'm Leaving It Up to You, which became a very, very popular song. And I think that's Dale and Grace right there. And we have a few seconds of the song.
You decide what you gonna do.
All right, now, I remember that song very well. Those around the table, maybe not so much.
Not so much.
That's called a belly robber kind of song. This was in the early days of doo-wop and swamp pop, and that was one of the first songs. And so this guy in Baton Rouge recorded them and tried to distribute it nationally. Well, he did, and it became very, very popular. So popular that 60 years ago this week, it was the #1 song in the nation, right, on the Billboard charts, and they would sell a gold record for it. Now, Dick Clark, who you may or may not remember, who was the big music entrepreneur, had these caravans, and he'd put these performers out, and they'd go and perform. Well, on morning of November 22nd, they arrived in Dallas. They were going to perform in Dallas that night. And so that morning, all these entertainers, some who were famous, some like Jimmy Clanton and other people, they went outside the hotel to watch the president's motorcade go by. And Dale would always claim that she waved at the president and the president waved at her. A few seconds later, the motorcade turned down Elm Street, and then shots were fired, and we know what happened there.
Right.
They didn't find out about it. The singers didn't find out about it until actually the whole world knew about it. For some reason, they didn't. But they were performing in Dallas that night, and here, like Dale and Grace, look at the big star. The #1 song in the nation was canceled, and then the next day they were going to go to Oklahoma City, and it was canceled too, and so they never had that concert. But anyway, they go down as like I think it's kind of like a moving moment to think of these two kids with the #1 song in the nation and the President of the United States passing by at that same moment and thing. And so that song has always been recalled as the song that happened with the thing. But anyway, as far as the other things, of course, the key player out of New Orleans was Lee Oswald. He was born in New Orleans at a hospital in the French Quarter. His father died when he was very young. And so his mother really kind of moved the family around along, but they went back and forth to New Orleans. He lived in Lakeview at one point. He went to Beauregard Junior High School, went to Warren Easton High School, but also just traveled along. After the conspiracy, and over the years about the conspiracy, like New Orleans, his name has come up, like with Carlos Marcello, they say, well, it was the mafia had done. Nothing has ever been proven about any of that. And then, of course, with Jim Garrison, had his famous investigation. I mean, Dave Garrison was like global news, but ultimately, when it went to the jury, it took the jury less than an hour to decide there's no case here, and Clay Shaw was let go. So despite New Orleans' name being involved, but the other thing about New Orleans was that there were a lot of Cubans coming into New Orleans during this time. This is during the Cold War and then in the Castro thing. And so Cuba was always part of the discussion, too. And Oswald first became known because of campaigning for fair play for Castro. He was putting out flyers, but
here in New Orleans.
Yeah. But in the end, when you look back at it, there's no doubt, at least in my mind, that when it was Oswald who fired and killed the president. Not about that. The question is, was anybody else involved in it? Was it part of a larger conspiracy? 60 years of investigative reporting, right? A lot of people could have won Pulitzer Prizes by then. This is the biggest crime in modern history, and nobody has ever been able to provide anything that contradicted.
Right. And, the President of the United States was killed on film. Ultimately, we saw the Zapruder film.
And, the Zapruder film wasn't released publicly until Garrison. That Garrison was able to subpoena it. And then when he showed it at his trial, that was the first time the nation actually saw the Zapruder film.
Yeah, what an event. And, 60 years ago, for those of us who were living at that time, it was really formative for us, through the rest of our lives. You remember those days, just everything stood still. There wasn't only concerts that were canceled. It was just everything stood still. And it was all televised. We watched it all. It was really quite a traumatic time.
And the most obvious thing that was televised was on that Sunday when Oswald was being escorted away from the police station. Jack Ruby shot up and shot Oswald. Everybody saw that. They had pooled television coverage, and so there was no doubt that happened. And some people tried to link Ruby with the mafia, and I think he did have connections, but it's not known that he actually knew Carlos Marcello or had any exact involvement.
Important part of our history, coming up 60 years next week. Okay, Dee, thanks a lot. All right, Greg, let's wrap up with you.
Sure.
You and WVUE, the Illuminator and WVUE, jointly reporting what's happened at Sewage and Water Board. The testers, the water testers, you found are not always doing their job, and this is really important because they're telling us about the quality of the water.
Super important. They're testing for coliform, which could indicate the presence of E. coli, things that are bad for you, obviously, and chlorine, which is their chief agent to ensure that the water is free of any of those bacteria. They file reports with the state health department. They're given addresses, essentially a log, which they are supposed to go to once a month. And there's just a handful of employees that are doing this. We got those state health records. We also got the GPS records of those employees. And there are instances where we know at least 4 employees were turning in logs, or their supervisors were turning in logs that reflected stops they weren't making.
So thereby the water was not tested.
The water was not tested. We're not sure what type of information. We're still trying to get to the bottom of that, where the information came from that was turned over to the state. But the Sewage and Water Board acknowledges there were stops that were skipped. 2 of the employees involved are no longer with the Sewage and Water Board. One has been removed from that responsibility and faces discipline, you would think. And we have a follow-up coming up on Tuesday night that looks at what exactly the supervisors knew in regards to the skipped routes. Were they part of it? Did they condone it? And a little bit more on some of the science involved that when they are testing back at the lab, are they doing it properly?
Okay, and that's another thing that you guys wrote about. Was there is a standard, a federal standard, and maybe the water was being collected, but those standards were not being met to give you an accurate reading.
Yeah, so when you basically, if you're testing at someone's home, typically that involves turning on a faucet and letting it run for a set amount of time to get rid of the stagnant water. You're putting it in a little vial. You're adding a reactant to it, kind of like you would test your water in your pool. But you got to let it a certain amount of time. You got to let it sit for a little while to show the presence of chlorine. And what we learned was, based on the test equipment's manufacturer standards, the EPA standards, what the state requires them to do, the Sewage and Water Board is saying, we don't need to do it that long. So we're wondering, when we've asked, what's so special about New Orleans water that we don't need to conduct the test that way? I don't know that we've really gotten a satisfactory answer, other than that the lab says we can do it.
And it's really quite an eye-opening report. And so we can go to louisianailluminator.org, because it's pretty complex. .com. All right. It's pretty complicated and complex, and then also WVUE. And so, like you say, Tuesday you'll have even more reporting.
Yeah, I think this is an onion we're going to be peeling back at for some time to come.
Any evidence it's been dangerous for us?
The Sewage and Water Board has said that the water was never compromised. The State Health Department backs them up. But if you were to ask, okay, show me the data at a specific address or part of town, they can't do it based on providing falsified info.
Still gives you pause. All right, other stories, guys. E.
Also on the ballot tomorrow are 4 more constitutional amendments. We had some in the last month, but there are 4 more. In true constitutional amendment form, they're very, very complicated. It's hard to make a decision, but what I always tell people is the Public Affairs Research Council does a good job. They put out a publication, they explain this thing, they give the arguments for or against. There's the website, parlouisiana.org. And so before you vote tomorrow, go to that website and take a look at it. You get something that you can understand.
Good advice. Thanks, E. All right, Rich, over to you.
This is a fun one. I had a great interview with E.J. Lagasse, Emeril Lagasse's son, who's helming the just newly reopened Emerils. What's interesting is Emerils is now 2 restaurants in one. There's 2 different entrances. You go through to the dining room, which has been shrunk, a lot less tables, and then there's a separate space where you come in for like snacks and fancy wine. But he's a great kid. He's 20 years old.
Yeah, that's pretty young.
Wow. But he sounds like
He's had a good teacher, that's for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot, Rich. Don, over to you.
Ready or not, here we go. Next week, all the red, green, and festive lights are getting lit up around the city. So maybe these dreary days will be matched by something a little prettier.
It's holiday time. Okay. Greg, over to you.
Another investigative piece on the St. Tammany Coroner's Office. The current office holder fired the replacement who voters elected to replace him. So he's out of a job, as is another person, because they reported another coworker whose behavior in the office they thought was inappropriate in regards to identifying a murder victim's body.
Okay, we'll need to go take a look at that one too. All right. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we'll see you again next week from Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.